So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the Northwest Coast Hall. Towards the end, I'm going to talk about some current initiatives that we've been developing over the past 3 or 4 years. But I really am interested in the origins of cultural relativism and how Boas sort of worked with that and manifested it in the context of the Northwest Coast Hall. So without further ado, studies of Franz Boas and his legacy constitute a veritable industry. Boas was perhaps the most important public intellectual on matters of culture and race in the early 20th century. He was the most influential anthropologist in the US, training almost everyone before 1940, including Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict, Zora Neale Hurston, Alfred Kroeber, and Robert Lowy. Boas's influence in anthropology extended long after his death, not least via the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss, and for a broader public, both academic and popular, especially via AMNH's Northwest Coast Hall. But given the prolific canon of Boas studies, I must begin with an admission that it's rather daunting to imagine what I might add, especially as someone trained in the distinctly non-Boasian tradition of Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown, to begin with, as a specialist primarily in the Pueblos Southwest. Boas did get to Laguna, but that was just for a very brief period, rather than the Northwest Coast. As a distinctly late comer to Boasian thought, and more by occupational hazard, as it were, as a North Americanist successor in the anthropology division at AMNH. And I'm daunted too because I'm speaking here in the Lion's Den at the National Museum of Natural History, the very target of Boas's epochal attack on museums of ethnology in 1887. Beyond the book-length works, there are myriad specific studies, notably by Ira Jackness, of the history of the Northwest Coast Hall itself, and, for example, by James Clifford of its value from the perspective of cultural studies. My aim here is thus modest, and my compass brief. My interest is in the Northwest Coast Hall as exemplar for cultural relativism, its origins in Boas's thought and practice, its transformation since Boas, its legacy, and its effects on public thought in art and culture, and its continuing value into the present. Boas's doctoral dissertation, Contributions Towards an Understanding of the Color of Water, was in physics, but its focus was as much on phenomenology, highlighting the effects of perception on measurement, or broadly speaking, the observer effect, that would subsequently become significant in both physics and anthropology. Boas's secondary thesis examined, quote, the interaction of bodies in motion and the analysis of forces acting upon them, quoting from Herbert Lewis. Lewis reports varying opinions by physicists on the proximity of Boas's questions to those later addressed by Poincaré and Einstein, but there is agreement that the underlying concern with relativity bears a family resemblance. My point is not to try to credit Boas with the origins of special or general relativity, a specious aim in any event, but to show that his emerging concerns that reached their apogee with the concept of cultural relativism derived from the same general context in physics as became indelibly associated after 1905 with Einstein. And indeed, some years later, in 1919, Einstein specifically utilized the notion of relativity in the cultural, and by this I mean Boasian, sense. The observer effect question in physics, quote, led me to psychological problems, unquote, or what were then known as psychophysics. Boas's first published article concerns the Unterschiedsschwelle, the differential threshold, referring to the least noticeable change in a stimulus in order for a subject to perceive it. Sometimes a subject, Boas's subjects for some of this were his younger sisters, would perceive this change, but at other times would not. Perception and apperception, the subject's assignment of significance to perceived stimuli on the basis of prior experience, substantively influenced the subject's apprehension of objective reality, as George Stocking summarizes this. Quote, Boas argued that there were situational factors, for example, the mental state of the subject, which affect perception in each instance and therefore the comparability of different perceived stimuli. More fundamentally, he suggested that various differences which traditional psychophysics assumed to be quantitative, like the intensity of light, were in fact qualitative, unquote. Boas's interest in the relationship between mind and environment, evident here, translated also to his passion for geography, which formed the basis for his first field work in Baffinland in 1883 to 1884. Boas described his chief aim there as follows: "The general study will be about the knowledge peoples have of the local geography, which will be followed by a psychological study about the causes for the limitation of the spreading of peoples. From here, I wish to gain the starting point for the general questions which psychophysics will give me possibly more rapidly and just as surely." Whether or not Boas's Inuit fieldwork should be treated, as it has been in guild histories of the anthropological discipline, as an epiphanous transformation across the great divide from geography into a new world of anthropology, it's clear that his attention to the relativity of phenomena vis-à-vis perception was extended and amplified. Moreover, this is one of the first records where Boas voiced that sense of relativism with regard to questions of subjective value and social justice, or what we might refer to in general as human rights, in relation to culture. As he famously put it, "As a thinking person, for me the most important part of this trip lies in the strengthening of my point of view that the idea of a cultured individual is merely relative, and that a person's worth should be judged by his Herzenbildung." That's been translated various ways, but the character of a person's heart, or nobility of character, is perhaps about right. "This quality is present or absent here among the Eskimo, just as among us." That's from December 1883. Boas recorded more than 900 Inuit place names, not merely as data of geography, but also of linguistics, psychology, and phenomenology. He later extended the same interest to Kwakwaka'wakw toponyms, work that presages the reawakened interest in place names, perhaps exemplified most powerfully in recent years by the work of Keith Basso on Apache place names. After his return from Baffinland, Boas went back to Germany via New York City, and it may have been his first visit to the American Museum of Natural History. I haven't been able to confirm that, but I sort of suspect that he did. In 1885, he began working for Adolf Bastian at the Museum of Ethnology in Berlin, but he was unable to get a university job, in part because of anti-Semitism. Boas was a secular Jew, but the Prussian establishment was increasingly exclusionary during this period. In 1885, he met his first group of First Nations people from the northwest coast, Heldsuck visitors to Berlin. He interviewed them, and this really initiated his interest in the northwest coast. His first trip there was from September to December 1886 to collect artifacts for the Berlin Museum. On his return, the plan was for him to go back to Germany, but he decided he wanted to remain in the US, especially in New York if possible, for personal as well as professional reasons. He was in love and wanted to marry Marie. And most especially, he wanted to be at the Museum of Natural History in New York. 1887 was perhaps the watershed year in Boas's or a watershed year in Boas's intellectual history. Instead of going back to Germany, he was able to get a job working as an editor of science. This led him to publish 3 brief papers, all landmarks of his developing relativist position: The Occurrence of Similar Inventions in Areas Widely Apart, Museums of Ethnology and Their Classification, and The Study of Geography. All had substantive influence on the development of thought in anthropology and beyond. Okay, so this is where I start dodging the bullets. From his ethnographic experience and theoretical interests, Boas is generally credited with pluralizing culture, shifting its focus away from a universal species attribute, more or less possessed by one group or another, the evolutionist model of Morgan and Tyler. Stocking has argued that the transition towards culture as tradition, in the Boasian sense, of which there were many distinct individual cases, emerged especially in the work of Boas's students, rather than his own. Stocking argues that Boas's assault on evolutionary ethnology, quote, was developed in a series of articles in the 1890s, culminating in his 1904 statement that, quote, the grand system of evolution of culture that is valid for all humanity is losing much of its plausibility, unquote, from Boas. My own view, however, in contrast to Stocking's here, is that this transition should be dated substantially earlier, beginning at least in 1887 in a museum context, both in theory and practice. The general neglect of the museum phase in anthropological historiography, I believe, is the cause of this failure to recognize the earlier theoretical tilt of Boas's thought. The occurrence of similar inventions in areas widely apart was Boas's critique of Otis Mason's evolutionist museology, right here at the Smithsonian, where objects from all parts of the world were arranged according to functional types in a grand Morganian scheme. Museums of ethnology and their classification provided an alternative that was explicitly relativist as represented in this famous quote. Can you all read that? Okay, so I won't read it. During the very span when his 3 science articles were published, Boas was lobbying for a curatorial position at the American Museum of Natural History. He secured an interview with Albert Bickmore, the department chair. The science articles, in effect, laid out his manifesto. If he were appointed curator, this would be his approach to ethnological representation, radically different from the key national rival in Washington, D.C. But Bickmore did not come through with the offer of a permanent position. However, he did give Boas a contract through the spring and summer of 1887 to catalogue AM&H's Bishop Powell collection of Northwest Coast artifacts, Boas's first work for the AM&H. Heber Bishop was an AM&H trustee who was interested in establishing an impressive ethnological collection for AM&H, and in 1880 he commissioned British Columbia Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Israel Powell, to make a collection of impressive Northwest Coast artifacts, including the Canoe, the Great Canoe, including these 2 I hate the word iconic, but it seems to apply in this instance. These 2 iconic pieces are a beautiful early Chilkat blanket and the Haida bear mother. This Haida, or Heiltsuk, or both, Canoe was part of that. This collection, the Bishop Powell collection, formed the core of AM&H's ethnological collections. I've always thought of the Canoe with its storied journey from Victoria to New York via the Isthmus of Panama. Before the canal, had to go across the isthmus linked between 2 railroad cars, as leading the rest of the ethnological collections into the museum. The Canoe was hung from the ceiling on the 3rd floor when it was a single building. The 3rd floor housed all ethnographic artifacts, somewhat jumbled together. The Bishop collection was relatively small, but it included some superb materials, especially Tlingit and Haida. Boas's catalogue, especially when juxtaposed with his position statements in the science articles, contains some key indicators of his ethnological thinking. Here we get the first sense of the Northwest Coast as a coherent culture area and what it comprised. And since I assume that is a bit difficult to read, I will read it. The Northwest Coast of North America is inhabited by numerous tribes of different lineage, all of whom participate in a common culture and a common mode of life. The distribution of tribes, he proceeds to enumerate 13 Tlingit tribes, Haida, Tsimshian, Kwakwakiwak, or Kwakiutl according to Boas, composed of numerous tribes, Coast Salish, including Bellakula, Nuhalk, and Nuchanolth, Nutka, he refers to them as Al. All these tribes live principally on fish, the halibut and salmon being chiefly depended on. And then it proceeds to be a description of fishing techniques. So this is his nod to what we'd call the economy. The tribes live in permanent villages. The houses are arranged side by side, either in contact or with spaces of greater or less width between them. So he's talking about the settlement pattern. If you're used to reading Holt Reinhardt Winston ethnographies, I guess that reveals my age, you'll know that this is the sort of way that a standard ethnographic monograph is set up, right? In the enumeration of the peoples in question, their economy, their settlement pattern. And on the next page, this is dear to my heart as a kinship specialist, sometime kinship specialist, the tribes are divided into gentes, clans. Among the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian, child belongs to the mother's gens. Among the rest of the tribes, it belongs to that of the father. So this is his nod towards kinship. He would later alter this patrilineal interpretation of Kwakwaka'wakw new mimes to pave the way for Lévi-Strauss's influential conception of société à maison, house societies. So the completion of a house, marriages, etc., are celebrated by festivals and dances in which the dancer wears the emblem of his gens as a mask or blanket or rattle. So here we're moving from kinship, social organization, into ritual and ceremony. Houses, boxes, drums are painted with the crest of the owner. Social status, artistic interest, prominent themes of Boasian studies later on. Other carvings and dancing implements represent spirits and are used in pantomimes or dances which can only be understood if the myths of the tribe are known. Lévi-Strauss would like that. So here we're getting towards ritual and myth and religion, broadly speaking. And finally, the meaning of many objects in the collection was ascertained by Dr. F. Boas. He refers to himself several times in the course of this in the third person on his journey in Vancouver Island in 1886. Boas was thus laying out a taxonomy of cultural content that would come to inform his sense of the culture area, an idea typically attributed to Kroeber and Whistler, and how to represent this via individual tribal components. The list of tribes, again, was to be foundational for the installation of the Northwest Coast Hall when he implemented that in 1899 to 1900. The next step along Boas's path at AMNH is represented in a little-noticed 1889 article in the Internationales Archiv für Ethnographie. My German is not really existent. It sort of does exist, but anyway, I apologize. On the American Museum's ethnology collections, after the addition of a major Northwest Coast collection, primarily Tlingit, purchased from George Thornton Emmons. Boas again suggested an arrangement of cultural components reflecting his bishop catalogue remarks that would later become foundational for the Northwest Coast Hall. And this is going to be too difficult to read, but the salient point is this Emmons collection, purchased from Alaska, is arranged in various groups: fishing implements and weapons, household goods, musical instruments, dancing and shamanistic implements. Among these, masks occupy a prominent place. If we compare this sort of categorization with the still current displays in the Northwest Coast Hall of the Tlingit cases, they completely, which also echo the arrangement in the other tribal alcoves, there is a remarkable continuity. Fishing and hunting gear and household gear. Painting and musical instruments. Shaman's equipment, shamanistic implements, if you like, in his 1889 words, and masks. All then, I'm really not cherry picking. It might sound like I am, but there is this absolute sort of parallel between the way that he's thinking about the classification of cultural elements in these various early sources with what happens in the Northwest Coast Hall itself. Following some further field trips to the Northwest Coast and his appointment at Clark University, and then later having worked with Putnam at the Field Columbian Exposition in 1893, in 1894 to 1895, Boas's next work for AMNH was a commission from Putnam, now head of the anthropology department there, to create a life case. Though fashionable in Europe, Boas extended the life case model to the instantiation of individual cultures of the Northwest Coast. Boas returned to the Northwest Coast and renewed his relationship with the Hunt family at the Kwakwaka'wakw Training Center at Fort Rupert. Boas's activities there included sponsoring a potlatch in 1894 This was against the Canadian government's anti-potlatch law. So this speaks to another aspect of Boas's interest, which was motivated by social activism. There's a very nice article by Claudia Roth-Pierpont in the New Yorker about 10, 12 years ago about Boas's role as a public intellectual, specifically vis-a-vis questions of race and social justice. But some of the main work that he did there was towards life cases for both AMNH and the Smithsonian. This is where Boas did the Hamatsa case for the Smithsonian. That was this same period. And having modeled this here, then it gets installed as uses of cedar at AMNH in 1895. And as revamped about 1960, split into two, separated into two parts and made into an oblong shape as opposed to a square, it's still there. The models really need some help. The mannequins, oh man. As we can see here. And then that was during the same period that he also put together this Kwakiutl village case, which is also still very much there. The success of Boas's life case led to his appointment as an assistant curator at the museum. In other words, now almost 9 years after his initial expression of interest to Bickmore, he'd gotten a job as an assistant curator. So this leads to the next phase, which is probably more well-known than the phases that I've just been talking about. Shortly after securing his curatorship, Boas conceived of and led the Jessup Expedition from 1897 to 1902, described by Stan Freed, my predecessor, as, quote, the foremost expedition in the history of American anthropology, unquote. The Jessup North Pacific Expedition was directed to exploring connections among peoples across both sides of the Bering Straits. It employed more than a dozen anthropologists and archaeologists and expanded the collections significantly. In relation to the Northwest Coast, as you can see here, it was specifically designed to expand in areas less complete than represented by the Bishop and Emmons collections. So, to quote these remarks at the bottom here, this is Boas's own map. He says, the colored region is the one that it would be desirable to have explored. The district marked 1, Tlingit and Haida, includes primarily Tlingit and Haida, although the tribes of British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon were those. I'm sorry, I'm skipping over that. The district marked 1 is the only one from which the museum possesses extensive collections. In other words, Boas was remarking that the Bishop Powell and Emmons collections were primarily Tlingit and to a slightly lesser extent mostly Haida. And so the Jessup Expedition largely focused upon, quote, tribes of British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon. Of course, Swanton did go to the Queen Charlotte Islands and collected more material from the Haida at that point as well. So just to be clear about that then, so on the Northwest Coast, all of the area colored is the area of expressed interest, right, for the Jessup Expedition. But on the Northwest Coast, it's only the area that's bounded by the black line where there was felt to be sufficient collections already. The principal attention, tribes of British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon, is this sort of beigey bit towards the bottom. So for these areas involving the Kwakwaka'wakw and the Coast Salish and others, Boas depended especially on George Hunt, who exerted significant influence on the development of Boas's thought. It was Hunt who insisted on collecting narrative traditions that went with masks and so forth. Boas and Hunt co-authored several works in the Jessup Expedition monographs published by AMNH. So the combined Bishop, Emmons, and now Jessup Expedition collections formed the core for the installation of the Hall of North Pacific Peoples, or Ethnological Coast Collections from the North Pacific Coast of America, to give it its full title at that time, which were installed in 1899 to 1900. this was the arrangement. Now, I'd ask you to just sort of remember this a little bit, because the history of the hall, as all histories, is full of mythology. So various people tell us once in a while, oh, you can't change that. That's where Boas hammered in his last nail. Nothing has changed about that hall since Franz Boas was here. Well, that's not quite true. So this was the arrangement of the hall as installed in 1900. And you'll see at the bottom here, so-called synoptic series. From there you go to southern Alaska. There on the north end to northern British Columbia, southern Alaska, Bellakula or Nuralk, Kwakiutl-Nootka, Kwakwakiwak-Nootka, north interior British Columbia, Washington State, sorry I missed that, and miscellaneous large objects. The uses of cedar life cases right here, the Kwakwakiwak village is right here, and these are all archaeology cases in the center. So there is clearly a sense, again, of this, the common culture of the Northwest Coast, and its division into individual cultures, individual, quote, tribal alcoves that are represented in this fashion, but it's not exactly as it is today. So this is how it looked. There's the great canoe, which hangs from the ceiling at this point. The cases in the middle, down the central aisle, are all the archaeological cases. There are no large poles. There is lots of natural light coming in from both sides. So, as is well known, Boas got into a fight with the administration, and in 1905 he decamped to take up his position at Columbia and remain there. He did retain relationships with a lot of people at the museum, and of course a lot of his students came to work at the museum, including Margaret Mead and so on. But part of the reason he got into a contretemps with the administration was because he was uninterested in sort of developing other halls along evolutionist lines, which the administration thought were more appropriate, and because he was too, I guess, I'm not, whether this is fair to summarize it in this way, he was too academic. So there's a great deal of information included as well in the hall were the published Jessup Expedition volumes. So if you were looking at a particular mask or a particular fish hook, you'd get a note saying, go to page 321 on volume 5 of the Jessup Expedition volume at the front of the hall, and then you'll read a detailed account of this. Well, this was clearly popular among researchers, but not so popular with the general public. And again, Boas was thought to be sort of too recherché for that entertainment interest that was one of the three principal interests that he characterized as defining the role of an ethnological museum in that 1887 article. So his successor, Clark Whistler, installed the hall that we mostly know today. The canoe was put on the floor. Emmons, whom by this point Boas rather despised, was hired to draw up a model for a sculptor to produce a sort of a notion of trinkets traveling to a potlatch, and these were installed in the canoe and remained there for the next 50 years. There's still natural light coming in on both sides. Some of the poles are brought into the hall. There had been no poles in the hall during Boas's time there. That's another sort of marked difference. They'd been in what we refer to as the west vestibule, which is nowadays a corridor. And there was no more synoptic series. There was no general explanation of what the Northwest Coast culture area constituted. In other words, there was nothing really to give you a sense of why a visitor who is not familiar with this area in the first place might want to look at the Nootka alcove or the Coast Salish alcove. There was a lot of the explanatory armature that Boas had spent time developing was thus lost. Now this is a current representation of the alcoves in the hall, and you can see that what Whistler fundamentally did was introduce a new kind of geographic orientation, but that the principal difference was the elimination of those synoptic series. This is how it's arranged into the present. Whistler was also part of the installation of murals between 1910 and 1927. He was involved with that. It was something, again, that was commissioned by the administration. And again, with a hall this old, people feel differently about these. A lot of my colleagues think that they're really neat and they really represent a particular stage in the development of museology. I would gladly tear them down and throw them away. But I also understand that there are different reasons for thinking about the value of things like this. They do not represent Boas's vision. Whenever any First Nations people come, they will say, well, the trees are all wrong. Those aren't West Coast cedar trees. Those are Atlantic cedars. And a lot of the body types and so forth look more European than they do Native American or Native Canadian. So anyway. By 1943, when this picture was taken, which is about the time that Lévi-Strauss first came, there was no more natural light. Both east and west sides of the hall had been closed in. All of the poles had been put up against blocked-in columns, and this is fairly similar to how you see the hall today. Alas, the beautiful parquet tile is no more in the center, although we do have a plan that we'd like to restore it at some point. So this was the hall, as I say, that existed when Lévi-Strauss came, and it was shortly after Boas's death in 1942, famously in the arms, it's said, of Claude Lévi-Strauss at the Columbia Faculty Club. How could we hope for a more fateful image of the passing of the torch? It was then that Lévi-Strauss penned a lyrical homage to Boas's hall in 1943, the one that you can see here. I won't read that. So the hall then was beginning to have multiple influences within anthropology itself and in public life in general in New York City, but because of New York City, much more broadly as well. In addition to Lévi-Strauss's working out of a variety of his structuralist principles, included, for example, especially perhaps in La Voie des Masques, The Way of the Masks, which he publishes in the early 80s, where he compares two of the masks, the Swaihui and Huihui masks and the Jonaqua masks, in a way that has resonated more broadly within his structuralist frame of reference. The hall also influenced a whole variety of other social constituencies, if you will. The famous MoMA exhibit in 1940 of Indian art of the United States was definitely inspired by the Northwest Coast Hall. The surrealists, notably André Breton, were specifically inspired by a lot of the materials in the Northwest Coast Hall. Even Jackson Pollock, yes, this piece in the middle is a Jackson Pollock. Doesn't look like what you'd expect, right? But this is a reference to totems that he's looking at in the Northwest Coast Hall. And of course, there's the famous passage from Holden Caulfield in Catcher in the Rye. Now, the reason that I mention this is that after a certain period of time, the hall sort of acquires its own sedimented history. So when I say that you can't change that because Boas put the last nail in, it's like there is a whole group of constituent sort of interests in preserving or representing the hall that don't reflect, say, First Nations interests, or the interests of anthropology more broadly considered. But they all sort of have to be taken into account as we think about changing anything or changing much in this hall going into the future. So the last major renovation occurred in 1960 when Stan Freed arrived. Stan didn't spend that much time on it himself. It was mostly done by Bella Weitzner, who was a secretary of Clark Whistler's, who'd been at the museum since 1908 and was an honorary curator of ethnology. At that point, the Canoe was completely taken out and placed in what we refer to as the Grand Gallery. A Tlingit potlatch case was added. The old Uses of Cedar life case was split into two halves and rearranged as, quote, Indians of Vancouver Island. And some new label copy was added, but not much. As any of you have been there recently, you can't find out a lot about this pole or that pole, where it comes from, or this object or that object. We are working on trying to change that. So this case was installed at that juncture. But more than these other constituent interests that I've described, the Hall and its representation of First Nations is of ongoing importance to those nations. And there are ongoing personal relationships between the Boas and Hunt families, for example. During the Chiefly Feasts exhibit in the early 1990s, these ties were renewed with the Kwakwakiwak especially. And from this, and here's another one between Gloria Cranmer Webster, some of you may know her, and Norman Boas, Boas's grandson, and the author of a very valuable sort of personal biography of Boas. And it's during this phase that appeared one of my favorite quotes about Boas that is in existence. I'd just like to read it briefly. "We strengthen what is left of our culture after the white people did their best to destroy it. In that task, we are more fortunate than most indigenous groups because we have a strong foundation to build on, and for that we owe much to Hitzakwath, Franz Boas, and Kihitasu, George Hunt. I wonder how many people whom other anthropologists have studied have the same feeling of respect and affection that our people had and still have for Franz Boas." Since I arrived at the museum in 2001, we have undertaken a series of efforts to study the Hall, its history, its significances, its ongoing relationship as a representation of First Nations cultures, with the eventual goal of refurbishment that seeks to honor the Hall's multiple constituencies. A temporary exhibit, which I co-curated, called Totems to Turquoise, enhanced our relations with contemporary First Nations, and we are continuing that into the present. But as I'm sure you guys are just as familiar with, funding issues tend to be rather a problem. To redo a permanent hall is a lot of money, and we are working towards that. We don't have anything to declare in that regard yet. But one of the most interesting things, and I will show a series of slides from my colleagues after this, is we've had, for the last 4 years, we've had a grant from the Mariposa Foundation, which is an internal trustee institution within the museum, towards digital enhancement, towards trying to conceptualize an updating of the hall and its various significances via the use of digital media. So this next group of slides represents that. And this is a superimposed image of the Haida artist Michael Nicol Yakulanas sketching in the hall itself. So this is how those project goals have been conceptualized to try to increase more engaged visitation and so on, to illuminate the history of the hall, which I'm very fond of, to leverage the Northwest Coast collections in ways that generate personal relevance for visitors, to bring a contemporary lens to the cultures of the hall. And how they're doing that is via a series of project strands, a digital kiosk, which has now been reclassified as a digital totem. I'll show you a bit of that in a second. A mobile app tour. This is the kind of thing that fills someone of my generation with horror. I'm trying to find out what a mobile app is in the first place, let alone anything else. A video bridge, which is very interesting, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. The first one that we did was with the museum at Haida Gwaii. An increase in live programming. This represents a visit by a Haida group a couple of years ago. That's Christian White, who's a famous Haida carver of argillite especially, but other things as well. And an augmented reality activity guide, which I'll also come back to in a second. So the findings of the initial research suggested that contemporary visitors want to have more connection between the past and the present. We went around surveying the people in the hall and said, well, when do you think this dates from? And, 500 years ago, somebody said, the time of the dinosaurs. And then they said, well, do you know where Haida Gwaii is? Oh, sure, Hawaii, yeah, I've been to Hawaii, yeah. Well, so we realized that we were not doing a very good job communicating contemporary interests and knowledge in a way that would enhance the ongoing significance of the hall. So this is one of Michael Nichols' pieces, his canoe, his copper canoe on the hood of his car, which is how you mostly see canoes in British Columbia, juxtaposed with the Haida canoe. And so we also utilize this as a way to include more people in filmed interviews and in sound interviews. Again, our initial focus was on the Haida. We have expanded beyond that now, but this includes several Haida people who visited and were interviewed at various junctures. And that also, it was critical for us to develop some sense of the nature of our interest to those First Nations communities. I traveled up and down the Northwest Coast within the last 15 years, in part as a way to try to generate more consistent and open relationships with different groups of people. But bringing more and more people to the museum in one way or another is I think, a more effective way of doing that over the course of time. So this sort of notional prototype in the center of Hall is what we're now referring to as a digital totem. And it allows you to press on a variety of things, including people, objects, sounds, the natural environment, and each of those will take you more in touch with contemporary folks, in this instance, Gujau, and Barb Cranmer. Some of you may know her from Alert Bay. She's Kwakwakiwak. And Evelyn van der Hoop and her daughter and granddaughter from Haida Gwaii. And then again, there's a video bridge. Now this is a pretty cool thing, and I'll show a little bit more about it in just a second. But this is what allows us to have live one-on-one contact with it, in this instance with the museum at Haida Gwaii, and where people in our hall can talk to people in their hall, if you will. And then the other part is we developed with a young Haida artist named Shoshana Green, and working also with Nika Collison of the Haida Gwaii Museum, a traditional narrative and ways of sort of drawing this and reproducing it for kids. So this took one of the masks in our hall and changed it into an augmented reality basis. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. I want to leave some time for questions. So I think, and then we also have established an artist in residence program as a result of that. This is Michael Nicol again. And this is his Haida manga. I don't know if you've come across that, but it's pretty cool stuff. Michael is very, how shall I say, skeptical of adhering too closely to tradition. He said, if I ever had to carve another totem pole, I think I would just throw up. So, this is not what we tend to imagine might be the case, but so he works in this tradition, in multiple traditions, and this is where he's having people in the hall draw a mural along with him. Anyway, he's a wonderful guy. If he hasn't been here, you need to bring him here and talk. He's a great guy. And this represents his interaction, standing in the Northwest Coast Hall with one of the curators at the Haida Gwaii Museum. I'll show you a little bit of this video bridge. So this is a beam, this thing here, and the person at the other end of it, in this instance in Haida Gwaii, can steer it in an alcove, can point out things in an alcove, and can give an explanation. And hopefully, I can demonstrate that.
Absolutely, all yours over there. Better than mine. So the maps, especially here that we see represented, ceremonial use.
Okay. There we go. This is after the interaction. Before was much worse on all these counts. And then this is the augmented reality piece and the narrative that became referred to as Dreams of the Hided Child. It's about a hided child going to the wedding of the older sister. So we developed an activity guide. Kids can color in this and so forth. And then here's the augmented reality bit. And they told me that they have just developed a more high-tech version of this, but it's really quite astonishing what they're able to do with this kind of stuff. And again, our prototyping has been very successful. We're delighted with the results of this. And that's it. Thank you.
So, questions?
You've shown us something that I've seen in some other museums, particularly in Europe, where you have this wonderful 19th century traditional material culture, and you have a wonderful 21st century intervention of contemporary artists.
We
The 20th century.
Yeah, we just went right past the 20th century, yeah.
Yeah.
It's largely circumstance, and certainly in all of the quite extensive conversations and plans that we have been working on for the past dozen years, there were many phases of how to address updating something that had nothing to do with digital enhancement. Some of us in anthropology were initially a bit skeptical about, well, yes, but don't we need to do a better job of interpreting the whole as it stands without the interface of this digital technology? And, obviously we need to attend to the existing infrastructure and the existing interpretive architecture as much as anything else. On the other hand, I've been absolutely bowled over with the effects of this. That sort of moving robot is amazing. And it really engages people in the hall, whether they're teenagers or older people, directly. We've had New York City high school kids in there talking to higher teens as well. And it's just a fabulous sort of interchange. So in that sense, yes, there has been this giant leap into the future and neglecting a whole period that really requires some attention too. But as I say, the results of this have convinced me that it's an excellent way not to address the problems that exist in the hall, but to include other perspectives, especially First Nations voices and interests, in a way that we otherwise haven't been able to do.
So is the plan to leave the hall intact, more or less, and to add labels and add interaction to it, or are you thinking more of also really reshuffling the architecture and the objects and so forth?
Well, the plans are ongoing, and again, we don't have funding in place yet to do a wholesale refurbishment. There are some competing arguments, and I didn't really encounter museum anthropology until I came to the museum. I was a standard sort of ethnologist for 20 years, and so I was kind of amused to start reading some things in museum anthropology about the curatorial voice, the power of the curator to shape the interpretation of things. And well, that may have been true in Boas's day, but I think, as I'm sure you guys experience as well, this is now a multi-part project, and I am one voice among several other very important voices, including the exhibition department, which is quite distinct from the science departments, including the education department. Now, both of those are now quite large, and they all have interests in how the hall might be refurbished and reconceived. The exhibition department has a very good track record. It's really a wonderful department. Both of those departments are wonderful. And so they tend to have data on how the public interacts with exhibits, and they've much more knowledge about that than I do, for example. So those are some of the internal sorts of differently structured constituencies of interest in the hall, and there are those that are external as well. And so that's partly why I showed those images of external constituencies. A lot of people in New York are deeply invested in this hall not changing and retaining its completely Boasian form, even though, as I tried to show, that shifted rather a lot in 1910. None of the casework is the same. The alcoves were rearranged significantly. The canoe was not there, or it was hanging from the ceiling, then it was on the floor and had mannequins in it, and then that was outside, and there were no poles, and then there were poles. In other words, lots of things have changed over the course of time. But people, you know, I took my kids there when they were small. Everybody has memories of when they first went there. It was very often with their kids. So they have this deep sort of social and local interest in the place. So there are those sorts of competing interests as well. I think what I would say, and I'm sort of dodging the question obviously, but I think what I would say is I would like to retain a lot of its existing exhibition architecture, because it's in part a museum of museums. Despite all of those changes, it's still the greatest tribute, in my opinion, the greatest public tribute to Boas's cultural relativism. This is where he made his argument, as it were, most graphically, most demonstrably, and least academically. And it's had an effect on the public consciousness for more than a century because of that. You don't want to mess with things like that too much. But at the same time, you have to be very careful about the introduction of, say, new digital technology, because it often seems incongruous. I mean, one thing that I've noticed in looking at museums on the Northwest Coast is that attempts to update have taken various forms. One thing is to say, well, all right, we have this fabulous Charles Eden Shaw bentwood box from 1900. Now let's put in a piece of contemporary artwork, maybe a piece of blown glass next to it. Sometimes that works, but at other times it seems really incongruous. And it's like, how are you, what argument are you making with this? That there is still a persistent culture, that these ideas, well, yes, sure, we're making that argument, but it just seems kind of, you know, higgledy-piggledy thrown together. So I think you have to be really careful about how you update a hall in that way. But you know, we do have some specific plans. We want to, if we get the opportunity to do this, to introduce some new foci in particular tribal alcoves. So in the Haida alcove, we particularly want to focus on crests, for example. In the Nucha North alcove, particularly on whaling, for example. So but those would tweak the existing structure. They wouldn't alter it fundamentally.